Hello and welcome. Today we will look at a topic that is often discussed very passionately, the headscarf and career. But we will approach it a bit differently, not through headlines, but through a scientific study by Svenja Adelt. She actually listened to the women themselves. So let's take a closer look. It is quite remarkable. Hardly any piece of clothing creates so many emotional debates. People talk about religion, women's rights, identity, and again about the question of what belongs in our society. These discussions are important, but they often risk overlooking one thing: the person behind the symbol. In public debates, it often sounds like this: the headscarf is a problem, a real obstacle to professional success, a sign of isolation or poor integration. But does this image really match the reality of the women who wear it every day? So let's try a small change of perspective. Instead of the big abstract debate, we will look at the everyday life of a working woman. Let's take Luisa as an example. She is one of the women interviewed for the study. She works as a research assistant at a university, and her life, like most of ours, consists of different roles and situations. And this shows something very important. Luisa moves confidently and strategically between these worlds. For work, she chooses a classic and professional style. In her free time, her style is quite different. But this is not a contradiction. It is something very normal. We all dress differently depending on the situation. This brings us to an important point. The headscarf does not have only one universal meaning. For the woman who wears it, its meaning is often deeply personal and can be very diverse. For example, for Nada, the headscarf is an expression of personal integrity. For her, it is a way to live her inner beliefs and her faith honestly in public. It is about keeping her inner values and her outward appearance in harmony. Melanie, however, describes a very different and rather practical experience. For her, the headscarf at work is almost liberating. She feels that people focus more on her competence and her ideas instead of her appearance. Two women, two very different but thoughtful reasons. This also leads us directly to the topic of career. The stereotype of the passive and controlled woman becomes very questionable when we look at the statements from the study. In fact, the interviews clearly show that professional success, education, and especially personal independence are extremely important for the women in the study. For them, religion and career are not a contradiction. They are simply two parts of their identity. Bushra's statement expresses this very clearly. Her desire for independence is very strong, financially, personally, in relation to her partner, and also in relation to society. It is a clear commitment to a self-determined life. But if the women themselves do not see ambition and religion as a conflict, where do the difficulties in professional life come from? The study clearly identifies external factors. The problem is not the women's personal beliefs but barriers from the outside. These include legal regulations such as neutrality laws in some German states, institutional rules, and above all deep-rooted social stereotypes and prejudices. One experience described by Shazanin, a doctor, is both shocking and revealing. In that moment, the symbol of the headscarf, which someone associates with a cleaner, becomes stronger than the symbol of the surgical coat, which actually represents a doctor. Here a professional qualification becomes invisible because of prejudice. The key point is this: the conflict does not mainly arise from Islam or the headscarf itself. It arises from the way society interprets and reacts to this visible symbol. The problem lies not in the practice of the woman, but in how others perceive it. This is why it is important to move away from simple narratives, whether they portray women as victims or as heroes. Reality is usually much more complex. Numbers from a similar study show this complexity very clearly. Almost all respondents, 94%, say that it is important for a woman to achieve professional success. At the same time, many support a rather traditional family model. At first this may sound contradictory, but it is not necessarily so. It simply reflects modern life, where different values can exist side by side. The women in the study also live this complexity in practice. Azra, for example, plays volleyball with colleagues in company sports and goes swimming in a Turkish bath. Asma is actively involved in interreligious dialogue. They are not withdrawing from society. On the contrary, they build bridges between different parts of their lives. So what can we take away from all these insights? Perhaps the goal is not to find one final answer to the headscarf debate. The author Kubra Gumaze once asked a very interesting question. Every woman whose life does not fit the stereotype is considered an exception. But if there are more and more of these exceptions, maybe the stereotype itself, the supposed rule, is simply wrong. And this may be the core of the issue. When we look at a woman and see only a headscarf, a symbol of oppression, faith, or separation, we stop seeing the person behind it. But this reduction disappears when we look more closely. When we see everyday life, professional ambitions, personal decisions, and also the contradictions that belong to every human life. And perhaps this is the most important step we can take, to lift our gaze from the symbol and see the whole person again. Thank you very much for listening. Today we discussed a study by Svenja Adelt from 2014. Do you have questions or topic suggestions? Feel free to write to YouTube at EmpowerMigra.com. EmpowerMigra, understanding begins with listening.